Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I was in Bratislava yesterday. I got in at 1 a.m. last night, and yeah, what a beautiful city. Thrilled to be here and talk to you about what we do at Microsoft in terms of threat intelligence and my team, which is coming up on the end of its first year. It's the Digital Threat Analysis Center. And I think the key point in terms of everything that we see is that warfare has changed. And that's why we're here today, because in part, the first place that we saw cyber warfare really start to occur was here in Estonia. And so my career starting back in the Army, moving to the FBI, from the FBI, moving out to work with special operations forces at different times, working with the US intelligence community, and then working in actually the private sector, in the banking. What's been interesting to watch is how the convergence of all of these things have come together. We track criminals, we track extremists, we follow them to the internet, and that is where a lot of the action occurs today across the board. The Digital Threat Analysis Center brings together the activities of a few different groups. My team joined Microsoft almost 1 year ago right now. And what we were able to do is work with two critical partners at Microsoft. The first one is the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, Mystic. It's routinely known by. You will see their analysis coming out here for many, many years. Some of it I will touch on today, and they provide the cyber signatures. They provide that attribution that we can see so that we understand who the actors are in cyberspace, something that we longed for just a decade ago. Second is the AI for Good team. We have artificial intelligence capabilities at Microsoft where we can really understand what's going on in terms of the internet. That comes to where my team joined from, which is working on malign influence operations around the world. 9 years ago, it was a member of my team and myself that discovered the Russians interfering in Syria. Those same accounts in January 2014 later went after the US election, the French election, the German election, and guess what? They're still out there today. That's where I want to start off with when we talk about Russia. The first shots in the war did not cross borders, they crossed networks. Microsoft on February 23rd of last year discovered what was known as the Foxblade malware, and working with many other tech companies, I would add, have seen all sorts of threat intelligence, both from cyber in terms of influence space. My team brings that together, and the way we would put that today, whenever we talk about it, is really 4 phases. We've watched Russian actors, mostly their intelligence services, but even some of their proxies in several different ways in both cyberspace and influence. They oftentimes work together, and our job is to really attribute those and bring those two pieces together. In the initial days of the war, we saw high volume destructive attacks. Many of the tech companies out there, Google, another one, Google and Mandiant being another one, provided lots of early warning, provided an enormous amount of technical support to try and make sure that we could secure Ukraine. And that digital space was flooded across the board. We say we saw the war coming in cyberspace just before, but months before, going back all the way to early January 2022, the propaganda and disinformation coming out of Russia were early warning mechanisms by which you knew they were probably going to conduct an invasion. After their invasion did not perform very well, you saw their cyber tactics shift, disrupt the flow of goods, aid, supplies. When they started shifting to the supply chain and cyber attacks, you also saw them start focusing on occupied Ukraine in terms of building in focusing on mobilizing all of their resources to do messaging inside Ukraine, which I'll give you a sample of. Next came that blended kinetic cyber info war that we saw through the fall last year. From the Ukrainian counteroffensive to missile attacks, we saw the bringing together of kinetic and cyber strikes, combined with influence operations that were both virtual and in person and expanding not just inside Ukraine, but outside Ukraine. And today, what I would tell you, what we're focused on is very different than what we were looking at a year ago. We see a focus on regaining system access in the cyberspace while they're elevating protests or amplifying them inside Europe. So I'm going to give you a blend of everything that we're seeing. What we've seen over the last really year inside Ukraine, we started to see a year before. You might remember in spring of 2021, we started to see cyber attacks from all elements of the Russian intelligence services. Here is a breakdown of all of them with our new naming conventions there. But what we saw is the GRU focusing on military targets, the SVR focusing really on their espionage targets, and the FSB, what I think is remarkable about it, having a very key role in many sorts of data theft operations. And that also doesn't even bring up what I'll come to in terms of the influence space. If we fast forward to what we see today, this is quite a change. Yes, we see the GRU and those actor sets doing attacks both inside Ukraine, but expanding out through the supply chain, so hitting targets that go beyond the borders of Ukraine. That's because the center of gravity for the fight in Ukraine today, yes, it is in Ukraine on any given day in terms of the kinetic battlefield, but the center of gravity now really extends out to Europe, the EU, NATO, and the United States. That is the backbone which keeps Ukraine in the fight. The Russians know this, and that's why you see in terms of their SVR targets focusing on foreign policy organizations again, because that's where they want to understand what policies are being made, how long can we continue to support Ukraine, what are some points of leverage they might be able to use. They've extended their capacity. And what we've seen over the last 6 months or so is the expansion of cyber proxy groups showing up in the cyberspace conducting attacks. You might have seen these hacktivists, so-called groups. They will hit targets with really lower sophistication attacks like DDoS, but what they are doing and what they are lacking in terms of cyber, they are doing in terms of influence. By that, they get a lot of exposure, and at the same point, it looks like they're larger than they are. Cyber proxies are really what we're seeing more and more of and suggest that the Russians, at least from a cyber perspective, have hit their capacity level of what they can do internally. And that really speaks to the type of weapons that they're using. I started off the conversation talking about destructive malware. The reason I did that is because that is the weapons that we've seen deployed since just before the war. It's what we've seen them iterate on since the war. But what I think is key in our recent Russian report is that they don't have the capacity to continue to iterate on these destructive attacks. Lori, who is part of my team here today, works on this all the time. And one of the key things that she and Fanta from our cyber part of our Russia team have really been able to watch is how these iterative attacks have happened in terms of them changing up malware, trying to use malware, recreate different types of ransomware. But why reach out to a proxy to try and have someone help you? Why reach out to expand if you could do all of that yourself? The answer is a lack of capacity, likely, at least in the present sense, that they can not keep up in terms of their cyber weapons. The other part that I think is critical for us to look at is the connection between kinetic operations and what we see in terms of cyber operations. Over the last fall, one of our reports that we showcased in December of last year is the increasing tendency that we see that military combined with cyber conflict in a very decisive way with the Russians focusing in Ukraine. This is something I had studied when I was in the military for many years, what we always expected would kind of happen. And what we're seeing is some sort of correlation between what they're focused on. The attacks and the targeting inside Ukraine match up. What we see in terms of cyber signatures, we're also seeing in terms of missile attacks. This also corresponds with what we see in terms of influence. And this is where I want to really focus on what we do in terms of the Digital Threat Analysis Center, which is understanding how influence and cyber come together. What Russia can do and could do for some time, which most other actors around the world, threat actors around the world cannot do, is combine their cyber attacks, hacks, with leaks to drive information. Only Russia has really perfected that art today. I'm going to give you another example here in a second of another country doing that. But what Russia's been able to do is really focus on that over and over. And what do you know when you see this group here, Seashell Blizzard, formerly known as Iridium, GRU is the way I'll throw it out to you today, start to do cyber attacks. Ironically, in the proxy space on Telegram, the cyber proxies will start to talk about these attacks. Whenever you're trying to understand a nation state doing malign influence operations, you look for what? Synchronization, timing, command and control, bringing together all the elements of influence together. With this, when you look bigger and broader, the main thing that my team brought when we came to Microsoft was focusing on how do we attribute in the propaganda and disinformation space. At the bottom is the overt media outlets that you routinely hear about of RT and Sputnik News around the world. Many of them were pushed offline by Western technology companies at the start of the war, and so their consumption's gone down. But where you still see focus at, and you still see reach, is at the top, which is where the Russian intelligence services and their outlets have now been attributed to different intel agencies. A remarkable discovery over the last 5 to 6 years is that the former Soviet states such as Ukraine, are oftentimes led in the information space by the intelligence services that used to operate there, the FSB. And one of those websites which still gets lots of traction, particularly in Eastern Europe, is Newsfront. Broadcasting in many languages, taken over by the Russians in 2014 in Crimea, this website still broadcasts in many languages, and oftentimes people go there because they are very quick to report on activities in Ukraine, even if they're not telling the truth. The other part of this is the amplifiers in between the oligarchs. All of these entities together amplify this Russian disinformation. Overall, I would tell you the network has not been particularly successful, even though they have tried. And what I would show you is that in each of these regions, we then boil it down so we understand the information landscape in any given country. This is what we've seen in terms of Russia's propaganda and disinformation space, which always blends several different parts. One, physical actors, people in the real world acting as influencers. In this case, it's called the fifth column. They have not been particularly successful. Second, part of Russia's campaign is always leading with information. What you saw them do is regular actors that we see all the time. The Kremlin trolls start to show up in southern Ukraine. What do? They establish Occupy Media. Occupy Media, not really in occupied Ukraine anymore, now on the retreat and moving elsewhere. All of this is connected through the ecosystem known as Telegram. Telegram is the dissemination tool by which today the Kremlin still gets its message out into multiple languages worldwide over many platforms. It's the way that they disseminate their message. Overall, this has been a poorly executed, not very successful operation, and that's due in large part to the Ukrainian people themselves who've been remarkable in this escape. They have authored a playbook for countering Russian disinformation and propaganda, dealing with cybersecurity in terms of their move to the cloud, working with tech companies to try and build their cybersecurity. We've seen that this echo chamber of Russian occupied media does not take hold because we see Ukrainians actually debunking it and refuting it themselves. A remarkable effort across the board. The Ukrainians have been able to crowdsource with their own citizens in the country, their own diaspora outside of the country, and with all of the Western allies and partners in their countries. They've been able to create organic counter messaging, something we've never seen before, executed in such an effective way. So combine this in influence, you see a downward trend in their overt information space. You see in the cyberspace, lots of defense being picked up, both by Ukrainians who've done an amazing job, tech companies jumping in, all of the NATO and EU countries supporting. It has been a team effort, and it is the first time that I've really seen the rails come off the Russian propaganda and disinformation machine. One thing, though, is they've expanded this. So we recently posted about how they've moved, not from focusing so much inside Ukraine, but focusing on using fakes to go after the Ukrainian diaspora. We reported on this in our recent Russia report. What did we see? We saw fake emails being distributed to people in many different countries that said that they were going to be mobilized, that Ukrainians were going to be mobilized by local immigration individuals. But what do they tend to do? They tend to use the same fake over and over. And because my team operates in many languages, we were able to detect that and put it together. We've seen these kinds of campaigns before. This is a trick of the trade that we've seen Russia typically use. That's a TTP. The other thing is they're training other people to do that. As you'll see up there in the UK example, someone decided to leave their hand in the picture. If you're an open source hunter, that's not a very good strategy to use. Watching these campaigns unfold, the other part that is always tied into it is what is known as active measures. Win through the force of politics rather than the politics of force. This is Russia's strategy adopted from the Cold War era when they were the Soviet Union, which is you go into populations, you start to fight them on the polls, get them fighting each other, and try and change the political dynamics in every country that's supporting the fight in Ukraine. These protests, yes, they occur in every one of these countries, but they are amplified on social media in a very, very large way. The most remarkable one of these was Moldova here in recent months, where you saw protests show up. There seemed to be some sort of Kremlin backing or effort in it. It was really pushed up in social media and in the news. Maybe there were some provocateurs on the ground. The strategy has not worked yet, but the question is, how does that influence operation unfold when we have several elections coming around the world in the coming months and the next year? What I think I would like to conclude with, at least when we're talking about Russia, is when you look at what they're doing, they're matching kinetic and cyber in terms of their attacks. They're using cyber to power influence in the information space. They're using information to power protest or mobilizations or provocations in the real world, and using that unconventional warfare is the way to try and keep their conventional warfare going. It's a circle that they've perfected for many, many years, but has not particularly worked well. And so at our center, what we're trying to do is hook all of those pieces together so we can understand intention, and when we understand intention, then we can do attribution. Let's move beyond just what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, because they are building an information alliance. If we looked out today, in terms of cyber attack discussions, if you went out on Telegram, we've seen increasing convergence between two actors, Russia and Iran. 10 years ago, the first accounts that we discovered that were talking about maybe Syria is right, maybe Al-Qaeda is at fault in Syria, were tied to Iran. Those Iranian accounts were then matched by Russian accounts. That is where I started 10 years ago. What I would tell you is increasing convergence now in the information space, both in terms of message and messengers, but also in terms of what we see in the social media space, alignment between these actors. You have a disinformation and propaganda alliance. That also makes you wonder, will we ever start to see more cyber alliances in terms of cyber attacks from authoritarian states? The one actor that is in some ways most interesting is Iran, because of how prolific and aggressive they are. Russia has scale and knows the art. They're always combining and creating synergy with these activities, but as you might see in our recent Iran report was published in May, we see Iran using a set playbook over and over again. An issue arises. It's related to Iranian foreign policy. Hacks are decided, targets are picked, social media accounts are created to elevate the issue. They attribute, they troll, and they try and impersonate or really bring into the media fold through false journalist accounts or compromised accounts information that supports their actions. We've seen this playbook over and over again. If you look at Microsoft, we discussed how we supported the government in Albania. They were targeted with a hack. But the way we were able to really track and trace that and really confirm our attribution was through social media. Charlie Hebdo magazine was another one that we did recently this winter. Same playbook, and in some cases even the same accounts will pop up on social media. It's a set playbook, and the reason I bring it up is it's one that is also ripe for elections. If there is some sort of foreign policy issue that's focused on a country around the world and Iran wants to intervene, this is a tactic that they will take. They will use this very, very specific hacking technique, the influence capability that they do have to create and wreak chaos. And you'll notice one up there targeting the United States, which was immediately confused to be Russia, was actually Iran in 2020. They actually created fake emails to make it look like there was going to be intimidation at the polls. That was a very sophisticated attack because all eyes were looking one way, and Iran was at least smart enough from their perspective to try and do something else. That's that false flag ability that they have been able to perfect in many of these attacks. Not only have we focused on Russia and Iran, this morning you might have heard during the Cyber Commander session a talk of Volt Typhoon. So in terms of China, we just put out a blog from Mystic. They did an excellent analysis around Volt Typhoon, which is a Chinese actor, going and attacking U.S. infrastructure, doing what really doesn't look like just traditional espionage, but trying to do insertion into networks that could be seen as preliminary for some sort of operation, either militarily or in terms of other activities they might want to conduct down the road. But what I would tell you is the Chinese are not copying Russia's playbook in terms of influence either. There's a common thing that you will hear in Washington, D.C. It could not be further from the truth. The Chinese are not rewriting the playbook, they're writing their own anthology, and they're using a very, very different method for doing this. Russia mastered the art of influence, China will master the technology. They have far more capacity, and their ability to scale is something we see in everything that they do. Two examples here that I just wanted to highlight before we move to some of the lessons learned over the last couple of years is one, their ability to influence through Chinese language websites. They haven't just launched 1 or 2 or 10. We're talking about dozens of websites pushing Chinese language articles that are actually showing up around the world at websites in different countries all focused on the Chinese diaspora worldwide. When they are not doing that, they are also using a very new and very shocking technique, which is influencers. We've seen them deploy more than 200 influencers in 40 languages around the world on social media accounts that are messaging every single day. We're not talking 1 million or 10 million, we're talking 100 million followers on these accounts. What do you do when you don't have messengers, when you don't have distribution outlets in every country around the world? You broadcast from one place inside China and you do it in 40 languages. Only one country could really pull off that kind of a technique on such a scale and in such a short period of time, 2.5 years. I beg any of you to try and launch 250 social media influencers at one time around the world in 40 languages. That is a massive scale that we've not seen anywhere before. So bringing it back, how does this work in terms of public-private partnerships? There's a few things that I would say. We're proud to be one of several tech companies that has been able to support Ukraine with our investment in terms of cloud, cybersecurity, information sharing that we've been doing. We provided that support. And I think the other thing is it's really brought together lots of lessons learned for how you might deal with a hybrid conflict. And what we tend to see, especially when it comes to cyber and information, is that there has to be some sort of connectivity in cloud anywhere and everywhere. You have to be able to back up your systems, and you have to have that plan there. I think it was General Melinda this morning, talked about what is your plan, what is your 911 whenever you have a catastrophe unfold. That plan is having your backup systems in place and your playbook ready to go. The other part is every resource is a target. What do I mean by that? .com, .mil, .edu, .org. Who do you think is going to be struck by cyber attacks? Once the war is kicked off and gone into more of a steady state, it's going to increasingly go to the .coms. It will move into the private sector. And so every resource needs to become part of what you think about protecting. The targets today were not the targets initially when the war kicked off, and it has expanded and will likely continue to expand around the globe over the coming months and years as the war continues. The other part is sustaining trust. In terms of the influence business, there are 4 things people tend to believe. This comes from World War II propaganda analysis. People tend to believe what they see first, what they see the most, that which comes from a trusted source, and that which is not accompanied by a rebuttal. If you're talking about cybersecurity defense, what do you have to do? You've got to be quick. You have to repeat what you're saying and get your message out over and over. You've got to maintain trust with your audience and with all of your cyber defenders in the public and private sector. And last part, you have to be able to issue rebuttals to any sort of disinformation or things that are out there. So I think it was 5 years ago, I was at the kickoff of the Hybrid Center in Helsinki, and we were talking about what would hybrid war be. And I think we can start to see what some of the principles would be for how you would effectively counter a hybrid offensive if it were to attack any country, a nation, an alliance, the European Union, and the United States. First, it's intelligence. You have to be out in front of all of these things. That's what's been remarkable since the start of the war in Ukraine, is how intelligence has been able to forecast what was going to happen, debunk things in terms of the influence space, help protect in terms of cybersecurity. Making all those decisions that quickly requires synchronization. Remember, first, most. Second, it's anticipating what's going to happen. Being able to put out your messages in the information space or deploy your cyber controls in advance of what you see is coming. To do that, you have to have great intelligence. Next is in terms of detection, whether it's Microsoft or any of the tech companies that have been supporting in Ukraine, what you've seen is they've increased their ability to do detection. Right before this, I was talking to somebody about what the big change that I've seen over the last 10 to 12 years. We used to talk about the time from detection to awareness to response. That time has gotten narrower. It's not perfect, and there's always slip-ups and mistakes, but our ability to coordinate more effectively and work together as teams, a team like this that's here in this room today, has really accelerated our ability to detect, and that comes to preparation. If you can prepare for these kinds of attacks, if you know what a hybrid operation might look like, coming to you from multiple angles as a country, it will allow you to put all of those decision-making processes together. Responding quickly is the most important, especially in the information space. 5 to 6 years ago, if there was a disinformation campaign or a propaganda campaign, people would say, don't say anything, just let it go. There's no strategy worse in an information fight than letting things go. You have to be able to respond, and you need to be able to respond based on trusted, having a rebuttal, doing it over and over again, and having access to the audience spaces that you need. So to do that over time, you have to constantly be communicating, and you also have to have a great network that you can talk to. Threat disruption, it happens in both ways. There's a kill chain in cyber, there's a kill chain in information operations. Can you patch and block? Can you climb the kill chain in both ways and do it very, very quickly? Doing that requires rehearsals and playbooks. Several people I talked to today talked about their red teaming operations. This is remarkable to see over the last decade how we have really improved on those, and we're trying to help support those every day in terms of what we do at Microsoft. So trends and outlook, I wanted to leave you with something of kind of what I'm looking for going forward. The first one I've already talked about was the expansion of cyber proxies. There are only a couple authoritarian countries in the world that can really insource everything. Everybody else needs to reach outside. And so cyber proxies have become a tool that the Russians have used. And when people see what the Russians are doing, guess what they tend to do? They tend to look for proxies as well. Proxies, though, have issues. If anyone's familiar with anything during the global war on terror, you learn a lot about proxies over time, which is trust and loyalty and command and control. And so there's weaknesses and strengths in that approach, and I think that's something that we need to think about in terms of attribution moving forward, how we will deal with cyber proxies. In terms of influence, if you look at all the techniques that are out there, the ones that are most advanced, they mostly fall in the private sector. Aside from Russia and China, and Iran a little bit, most countries that want to do malign influence have to outsource it to some degree. And even when the technology and the methods increase, you will see all authoritarian countries, all the hostile threat nation actors reach out to acquire that. Recently, there was a deepfake, anybody see this, a deepfake campaign of a telecaster who said something in English. That was a commercial service that a nation state had acquired. So understanding where those capabilities go, and that really comes to AI as a tool rather than a weapon. Brad Smith, who leads my division at Microsoft, he'll often talk about everything in terms of technology as a tool or a weapon. So we want to make sure that we're using things as tools, AI as a tool, rather than letting AI become a weapon for things that are out there. The last point that I think is really critical as we move into election season, in the United States, election season is every day, but in other countries, you have elections at routine intervals, and there are many that are coming up. In terms of that, understanding how election interference or hacking and leaking will occur really comes down to diffusion of audiences. Right now, you're seeing incredible diffusion of audiences over different social media platforms, which have different functions. All social media platforms are not created equal. Each has different audiences that are out there. Understanding how audiences shift back and forth over time is really critical to defending for an election interference in the coming months and years. So I think if I didn't talk about AI during this presentation, then I would have not been up with the times. I don't know if you've heard, artificial intelligence is around now. It's the topic. I was just in Bratislava at GlobeSec. And so yes, defending against AI-enabled cyber attacks is critical to what Microsoft is doing. But we are aware of it. And so one of the things that I find remarkable, I actually wrote a book before I came to Microsoft about the first two generations of the internet. The first decade was defined by a great utopia of the internet and bringing everybody together. And we encountered cyber criminals, extremists, and then nation states all using it as a weapon. Next came social media. And we went from everything to the Arab Spring to election interference. And so now you see in this third decade of the internet, the artificial intelligence era moving on board. Lots of great opportunities, lots of fears at the same time. And so what I am super proud of, joining Microsoft here, coming up on my first year, not even really thinking about this, is we're already incorporating AI into everything that we're doing inside Microsoft. So my team, Digital Threat Analysis Center, we're coming up with our whole plan to how do we detect and use AI for good whenever we see people using AI for bad. So it's a key principle of what we're looking at. The second thing that I would want to note to everybody is that, yes, AI has lowered the cost for making maybe lots of messages, but you still have to get people to read them. And I don't know if you watch, but people still like watching more than reading. And so part of what we're analyzing is how AI is being used. Is it being used as an effective tool or as an effective weapon for those that want to do malign influence? When I'm looking at those things, there's one thing I would always note. AI is also good at detecting AI. I will give you a case study of this. What was the first thing teachers were worried about in terms of AI? Students would use AI to write their papers. My intern from 2 years ago, who is a student at Princeton, in one weekend used AI to create a tool that could detect people using AI for writing their papers. So what I would say is the best way to detect malign influence is a human is good at detecting a human. AI is good at detecting AI. My team is working diligently and aggressively right now to get out in front of this to make sure that we can make sure it's a tool rather than a weapon. So just to close, as I think we come up on the end, and I know I'm stopping you from having an enjoyable night, so I'll finish up. The Digital Threat Analysis Center, we work with Mystic. Mystic puts out lots of fantastic technical reports. We also have started to put out our own public reporting. What you see up there is DTAC reports on Russia, DTAC reports on Iran, some on China. We will continue to do this at a very regular interval now, and we try and bring together the insights of everybody at Microsoft. So if you're interested, you can go to Microsoft on the Issues, where you can find these reports written by my team. We speak and work in 13 languages, 14 if you count English, although I'm not even that good at English myself. We work in all platforms. We use AI to do data analysis and analytics, and we team up with the two best teams that I've ever worked with, Mystic and AI for Good. So thank you for having me here today. If you're interested in what we do, you can go to Microsoft on the Issues, anywhere on social media. I'm on LinkedIn, which is also a Microsoft company that we're proud to partner with, along with GitHub and Bing. And so thrilled to be here today. And I think, do we have time for questions? Yes, no?
Yeah, 1 or 2 questions if you're up for it.
Sure, yeah, I'm good. Yes.
There is one in the back, I see, yeah. And one.
What do you think, what is the role of cheating the attackers? No, like actually this Macron campaign did, actually they implemented the fakes in their own campaign. Later actually when they came out, actually then they were able actually to pinpoint the fakes.
So this in terms of Macron campaign, is that correct?
Yes.
So I think in the influence space, I'll just speak more broadly beyond just the Macron. There are TTPs, and those TTPs can be matched in the same way as cyber to different actors. If you were working with our team, we almost, as soon as we see a narrative come out, you'll see everybody on the team go, Russia. And then we start to work back. Now, that's a hypothesis, and we work back analytically. But what I would say is the malware is to cyber what inauthentic will be to influence. And so in cyberspace, we talk about advanced persistent threats. In influence, my team focuses on advanced persistent manipulators. We have the same sort of focus on objectives. Some are more sophisticated. We're always tracking TTPs or methods, tactics and procedures, and then we're trying to tie that to actors. And so the same sort of approach, that victim-centric approach, let's say it's Macron in this case, you can still start to build a case study of it. 2 other things I would just note is, one, there are a lot of technologies that are already coming on board. Microsoft's chief science officer, hopefully I got his title correct, Eric, we're already talking about doing digital watermarking to try and do reality verification in terms of provenance of media. So we're starting to come up with solutions to that, which really addresses your point of how do you know what is real or not. I think the other part is the more that we can start to understand and attribute influence operations, the same way you see Mystic say these are hashes or codes or executable files, my team is working towards saying these are examples are indicative of deepfakes, influence activities, TTPs, bots, those sorts of things. So that's what we're building almost in parallel, the same sort of methodology that you see in cyber. Hopefully that answers your question. I think there was another question. Yeah.
Hi, so thank you very much for your interesting insights. First of all, sorry for holding you all off of your evening program. Just a brief question, which I found it quite extraordinary that now a private company is holding basically an intelligence briefing in a NATO-sponsored event, and I have a question where do you think is this trend? I mean, it's not just Microsoft, but for example, also Mandiant, for example. Where do you see this trend of basically privately own intelligence analysis going in the future, also considering democratic oversight and working together with government? Yes.
Sure. So, as you might know, I was in the government once. My technology works better now. Second, what was interesting, coming from the military, FBI, intelligence community, you could see about this much. And at Microsoft, you can see this much. And you get to work with so many interdisciplinary people that are seeing things. I think the importance of what we do at Microsoft, and I can't speak for the other companies, but I think they would probably share it, is most of the attacks and most of the malign activity is not happening in the government anymore. They're almost the last to know. And there was a weird period before I came to Microsoft, about 2012 was the last time I was working in the government. I moved out and I was like, holy cow, I can see everything out here. And nobody's, telling me not to look at social media, right? I can see what Al-Qaeda and ISIS are doing. Now, that doesn't, negate the role of government, which should be, separate and different. But I think for a tech company that sees cybercrime, malign activity from influence to cyber, we can help inform everybody to be safer because we are the ones seeing the activity and the incidents. In the counterterrorism era, we used to say, you see something, say something. I think private sector companies, Microsoft included, and that's why we're here today, are trying to tell you this is what we're seeing, because we want to make both the internet a better place and a safer place. We want AI to be great and improve. We want democracies around the world to succeed and be successful. That's how we're contributing to that. And I think part of the reason that we evolved as a tech company is because we evolved in these democracies that are there. So I think we're partners in it. At the same point, Brad Smith last week, rolled out his principles for AI. And one of the key things he did is said, we're here to help support regulatory frameworks, so that governments can be informed about what it is. If you don't know what's happening in the information space, the AI space, the cyberspace, how do you craft that policy? I think without the private sector, there's no way to fully understand that. I think that's what our role is at the Digital Threat Analysis Center. But we're part of a much bigger and broader portfolio. At Microsoft, you'll see the Democracy Forward team. You'll see digital diplomacy. All these teams are trying to think about what's the best way to engage with governments. So positive contributions, I think, are important. And there is what is known in the intelligence community when I was in the government as a duty to warn. And so, what duty do these countries have? I think what we're doing in terms of our analysis, we're trying to forewarn in terms of what we see. Yes.
Hi, I'm Karen Gutierrez from the Army Cyber Institute. Thank you. This was super rich, this discussion. I have a kind of a follow-on question to that about what is in your span of control, as a major corporation. And I think about two things come to mind. One is the great decoupling that we've seen happen with China and the technologies and the integrations of technologies and the supply chains. Another would be, an example of Microsoft coming out of Ukraine, out of Russia in the wake of the invasion. And then the third would be these botnets using systems that are exploiting Microsoft users everyday people all over the world. What kind of span of control do you as a corporation have over some of these malign activities that you're seeing? And where do you see it going? Thanks.
Yeah, I think the big one is when you look at how the world unfolds in the digital space, there's 4 layers to it. Infrastructure, application, content, control. Microsoft, our responsibility, and really what we're trying to do is always improve the integrity of infrastructure and applications. Microsoft has all sorts of technology applications. We're offering services all around the world. We're going to be at the forefront of AI. So doing that responsibly means that's where we can implement things at our level to improve what's going on around the world. So, we can both inform that in terms of like how we build things, but I also think in terms of how we do our information sharing on those two is critically important. So that's where Microsoft is at, and I think that's where we focus.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sure there's still much more questions.